Over the next several videos, we're going to take a look at layers inside of Photoshop, a much more in-depth look than we've taken so far. However, as opposed to really just dumping one great big long video that discusses every single thing having to do with layers, I'd like to break this up into some smaller bite-sized segments. So in this video specifically, we're going to talk about creating layers, about arranging layers, and a brief rundown of the layer panel interface. Now when I say brief rundown, that's because a lot of the things that you see inside the layer panel can get pretty deep and are really worthy of their own discussion. So we're going to separate those out into their very own lectures. So for starters, let's talk about creating our own brand new layers. Now currently, I'm looking at the Essentials workspace. If you're not, make sure you click on the Essentials button at the top of your application bar. And if you need to, use the drop down next to this to reset your Essentials workspace. Now, when you do that, you're going to end up with your color group, and then your adjustments group, and then your layers is down here at the bottom. What I'm going to do is right-click on the dark gray bar here on my adjustments panel, and I'm going to choose Minimize. And that's just going to make that get really small and give me a lot more room for my layers panel, which will be very nice. Now, to create a new layer, there's a few ways to go about this, and the way that I generally do this is to just click on the New Layer button. So you click and you get layer 1. Now of course that's not the only way to go about this. I can also delete that layer if I click on the trash can, and I'll get a little warning that says, are you sure you want to delete this? You can choose not to show that again if you want to, or if you create a layer and you just drag this down to the trash can, you actually won't get any kind of a dialogue. So just food for thought. You can also go to the layer menu and choose New Layer, like so. When you do this, however, you are going to get a little window that pops up, which is going to ask you for some options. First off, do you want to name this? We could call this My Layer. And naming layers is extremely important. Even if I'm not doing it so much in this demo, please understand that the more you get into layers, the more important it's going to be to really see what each layer is doing to make sure you have a good name on there. Use previous layer to create clipping mask is not going to be particularly helpful to us now, so we'll leave that off. We can choose what color we want the layer to appear in the layers panel. So I'm going to set this to orange just as an example. We can go ahead and set its blend mode now. I'm not going to deal with blend modes at the moment. They really are worthy of their very own discussion, so we're going to keep this fairly simple. Next, we can set the opacity of our layer, which is not something we're going to do right now. So we'll go ahead and click OK. Now check it out. We have a new layer. It's called My Layer, and you'll notice it's flagged as an orange layer. So we've just created that through the menu. I'm going to drag this down to the trash can and get rid of it. Another way is to use a hotkey, which is Shift-Control-N, and I use that a lot as well. The big reason why I often find myself just clicking on the New Layer button, though, is I don't get any options. So when I know that flat out I just want to make a layer and I don't want to have to worry about windows and whatnot, I just hit my little button here in the corner and I get a brand new layer. If you need that window for any given reason, you can right-click and choose Layer Properties, and you'll get that again. And now you can choose the color and you can choose the name. All of the other features that you had access to, if I go back over and choose New Layer, a lot of these are no longer relevant when you're done creating your layer. So using previous layer to create clipping mask won't be helpful after you've already got it created. Of course, we could change the color. And then changing things like the blend mode and the opacity, they're already here. So we can change those at any given time. Now let's do some things with our layers just so that we can kind of see what's going on. I realize that hopefully at this point you've seen a little bit of layer theory, so you're at least familiar with the idea of why we would have layers in the first place. But even if you're not, this will probably help drive some things home. I'm going to get the paintbrush out and get a nice great big brush. And I'm just going to write the number 1 here down as a layer. I'm going to create a new layer called layer 2, and let's change our color to some shade of red. And I'll write the number 2. And then we'll put in another layer. This time it only makes sense if we go with green. And so we have 1, 2, and 3. Now you'll notice over here in my layer panel that these are all stacked on top of one another. You'll also notice, if you look really closely, that each number is drawn on transparency, which is why you see that little checkered background back behind each number. It just tells you that this thing has been drawn on top of transparency. As a matter of fact, if I jump all the way back down to the background And we haven't really talked about adjustment layers yet, but I'm going to do this anyway. If you go down to the bottom of the layers panel, right in the dead center is this little button that is half black and half white, and this allows you to create adjustment layers. I'm going to click on this and choose solid color. And when I do, I get a color picker, and I'm going to pick some dark gray. And click OK. And now you can see that each one of those numbers was actually drawn on top of transparency, because I have a background that I can do anything I want to. So we'll go ahead and just throw away that color fill. I'm going to do that by dragging that down to the trash can, like so. Now currently, we can see the arrangement of these layers. We have 3 on top, then 2, and then we have 1 at the very bottom. That arrangement is very important because it is exactly how you're going to see the stack of layers. Notice that 3 sits on top of 2, which sits on top of 1. You can change this organization at any time just by dragging these layers around in the layer panel. So I could take 1 and drag it to the top, and notice that a line appears for anywhere that the layer could go. If you look really closely, we now have a dark, thick line between layers 2 and 3. And then if I drag all the way up here, we have a dark line that appears above layer 3. And now when I let go of the mouse, the 1 drops up to the top. We can bring layer 2 up and stick that between 2 and 3, and now they are, in between 1 and 3. And now they are stacked in reverse order. We have 1 on top, then 2, and then 3, like so. Now each one of these layers is completely independent, so if I grab the Move tool, which is under the V key, or you can click, it's the very first icon over here in your tool panel, we can start moving these around. So notice I have layer 2 selected. I can move that down here. We can select layer 1, move over here, select layer 3, and move that over like so. So we can start separating these. Each one is completely independent. Now, I said earlier on in the video that I wanted to talk about creating and arranging, and then I wanted to give a brief rundown of the layer panel's user interface. So let's go ahead and do that. Again, some of these aspects of the interface I can't really discuss right now because they really do kind of need their own discussion. So the first one is actually something we've got to save for a little bit later. This allows you to choose the blend mode of your current layer. Now to give you just kind of a brief example of how that works, I'm going to take my layer 1, I'm going to move that on top of layer 3, and then my little blend mode drop down, I'm going to set this to multiply. And you can see that wherever layer 1 crosses over layer 3, there is some form of blending taking place. In this case, the value of the pixels is being multiplied by each other, giving us a darker result. So it's kind of like blue being multiplied by the numerical value of green. Don't worry too much about that. That's not something I really want to dive too far into, but as I start to move this around, you can see the result and how that's kind of blending between the multiple layers. So let's go ahead and set that back over to normal for the time being. Next we have opacity. This is pretty straightforward. It's just a percentage slider, and as we start to drag it down, you'll notice that the layers become transparent, or more transparent. I can take layer 2 and pull it down to about 50, and then take layer 3 and pull that down to about 75. The neat thing about doing this is even without using a blend mode, because they are transparent, you can see that some blending does occur in between, because it's like something that you can partially see through, which is why you've got a little bit of blend taking place from one to the next. We have blue and red making kind of a form of purple right in between the two. Let's go ahead and set opacity all the way back up for all 3 of these. Now, moving down from here, I'm actually going to start at the right-hand side and work my way back. We have fill. Now, right out of the gate, fill is going to look like it works exactly like opacity. And at this stage of the game, it really does. But it is different, and it's hard for me to go into how different it is without getting into layer styles. Layer styles are something that it's really going to have to be their very own lecture, but I can give you a really, really quick example. Watch this. At the very, very bottom of the layers panel, we have this little tiny icon, looks like an FX. That's for layer effects, or layer styles actually. If we click on this, I have all kinds of things I can add to my layer. We have things like drop shadow, inner glow, outer glow, bevel and emboss. Some of these are pretty cheesy, some of them are very cool. Let's go ahead and do a drop shadow. Now, some options pop up for our layer style. I'm not going to touch any of these, okay? But with the layer style window open, I'm going to come out here to my document, and drag out slightly. And you can see how I'm kind of separating that shadow, and that is updating some settings for us, as you can see. Let's go ahead and click OK. And now I have added an effect to my layer. You can see this has got its own little drop shadow, which is pretty neat. Now this brings us all the way back to what I was talking about a second ago with our fill. Now if I take my fill and pull it down, take a look at what's happening. Can you see what just happened? We lost the pixels, but the effect remains. Now watch what happens when I lower opacity. Everything fades away. So there's the difference between opacity and fill. Opacity affects the entire layer along with any effects that have been applied to that layer, where fill only affects the pixels of the layer itself, but it doesn't touch any of the effects. The neat thing about doing something like this is that now if I grab my brush, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and we can write out something like shadow, and you can see how that's leaving a nice little shadow behind. And in this case, I erase that and I'm actually painting something down, which is also kind of interesting. So what I'm going to do is just hit Control-Alt-Z and we'll just step back through history and make that all disappear. So let me go ahead and pull my fill all the way back up. One more time. Opacity does all the pixels, and fill just does those pixels of the layer itself while leaving behind any effects. Now with that demonstrated, I am going to get rid of my effect by just selecting the effect itself and dragging that down to the trash can. You'll notice as I drag we get a little FX to let us know that that's what we're moving as opposed to the layer itself. Okay, now working our way back over to the left, we have a series of locks that we can apply to the layer. From left to right, we have lock transparency, we have lock pixels, and then we have lock position, and finally we just have lock all. So lock all just kind of locks everything down. But let's talk about each one of these individually for just a moment. Now notice I have layer 1 selected. To really drive this home, I'm going to hide layers 2 and 3, so this allows me to jump a little bit ahead in the interface. If I click on this little eyeball icon for each one of these layers, those layers disappear. I just want to focus on layer 1 right now, and that's the only place I really want your attention to be, so I'm going to hide everything else. If I lock the transparency, what this does is this means Photoshop records what pixels on this image are filled in and which ones are transparent, and it will not let me change any of the transparent pixels. So notice that my paintbrush is currently green, so I'm going to hit B, and I'm just going to start scribbling on my 1. You see what's happening? We are indeed able to paint, but those areas that were transparent can't be touched. It's like they're protected. That's because we've locked transparency. So all of our transparent pixels are off limits, and we can't actually touch those, no matter how hard we try. I can scribble on those as hard as I want, and nothing will ever appear. Next, we have lock image pixels. Now, if I jump back over to my brush, you'll notice something very interesting. I'm getting this little circle slash icon, which is basically telling me, no, you can't do what it is you want to do right now. And if I click to try to paint, it says could not use the brush tool because the layer is locked. So it tells you that the pixels themselves are locked. You cannot paint or make any changes to this. However, we can move it around. So if I grab the Move tool, which again is located under the V key, or you can click on the Move tool icon located at the top of the tool panel, I can drag this guy around and reposition it however I see fit. I just can't paint on it. Next, we have Lock Position. If I try to move the object now, we get a little warning. It says could not complete your request because the layer is locked. However, if I want, I can paint all over this. And I can make any combination of these locks that I like. So for instance, I can lock position and transparency, which means I can't change the transparent pixels, and I can't move the object, but I can paint on any pixels that already exist. Finally, you have lock all. This prevents you from doing anything to this layer. So we can't move it, we can't paint on it, it basically just shuts it down. If you have something right where you want it to be and you don't want to accidentally bump it or destroy it or make any changes to it, then be sure you lock all of the parts of it. Also notice that when you lock all, your opacity and your fill also get grayed out as well as your blend mode. This whole thing is pretty much shut down. You can't do anything with it. Okay, so that's a quick look at lock. Now let's come back down toward the bottom, and on our way down, we can take a look at each one of the entries for the layers themselves. And you've already seen how we can use these to reorganize our layers. So I could take layer 3 and drag it to the top, take layer 2 and drag it in the middle, and I've just reorganized all of my layers Of course, with only layer 1 showing, we can't see all of them. So let's go ahead and use that as an example to come back over here to visibility. So I can click on this little tiny box, and when you see the little eye icon, that means that that layer is currently visible. Now, a quick thing about doing that, if you have a whole lot of layers and you need to switch them all on or off at once, please note that you can click and drag down this list, and you can turn a lot of layers on and off at the same time. So, for example, if I create layers 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, so I'm going to grab layer 4. Now, all of these are just going to be black. I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time doing this, but let's do a 4, and then a 5, and then a 6, and a 7, and an 8. So they're all kind of stacked on top of one another. And you can grab any one of them, and you can move them around. We can click and drag down this list and turn off any number of these, or we can turn them all back on by clicking and dragging, which is a whole lot faster if you have lots and lots of layers than having to click each individual one. So it's just kind of a nice little thing. Also, you can hold down the Alt key and you can click on any individual layer and just make that layer visible and nothing else. So if you know you need to make some changes to just one layer, you can just hold down Alt and click on that one. If you Alt click on it again, it brings everything back. Do watch out for this a little bit though, because I've worked with some documents that just have tens and tens of layers, sometimes maybe over 100 layers. And if I do this, hold down Alt and click on one layer, everything else disappears. If I then go through and click on one of these again, we run into a little problem because I now no longer have a way to just alt-click and bring everything back. So do be aware of that, especially if you've made a really complex arrangement of visible and invisible layers. Okay, so now moving down from there, let's go ahead and get rid of those extra numbers since we don't really need them. I guess I could talk a moment about layer selection since you just saw me do that. Of course, you can click on any one of these layer tabs and select that layer. This is just like in Windows actually, if you hold down Shift and click on any other layer, you'll grab that layer as well as any other layers in between. If you use Control instead, you can just grab each individual layer. Now what I'm going to do is click on layer 4, hold down Shift, click on layer 8, and I'm going to drag all of these at once over to the trash can, and that'll get rid of all of those at one time. Another thing you should know about layers is you can select all of the pixels within a layer, all of the opaque pixels, based on their level of opacity actually, by holding down the Control key and clicking on the thumbnail for that layer. So if I hold down Control and I click on layer 3, you can see the marching ants stating that I have selected the pixels here in this area. And I can use this selection in other means. So I can grab my marquee select tool and I can relocate this selection and do other things with it. And we'll talk more about selections and how those work in a later video. Alright, moving down from here. Let's take a look at this little bar across the bottom of our layers panel. First off, we have the link button, which is going to stay grayed out for a little while. What this allows you to do is take more than one layer and link them together. So if I select layer 1, hold down Control and select layer 3, suddenly this is no longer grayed out, and I can link these two layers together. The reason this is cool is that now if I grab the Move tool and I start moving layer 3, notice that layer 1 comes along for the ride. They are treated, for all intents and purposes, as if they were the same layer in terms of transforming them. If I unlink that layer, then you see that they do kind of get separated. Okay, now next to this we have effects, which we already took a look at just briefly. So if I click on this, we get a list of all of the various layer styles that can be applied, or layer effects that can be applied. Technically, a style is going to be a collection of effects, if you want to get hardcore about it. But like we could select bevel and emboss. And if we just go ahead and click OK, you can see if you look really closely that that does look like it's kind of rising up off the canvas like puff paint. And we can take that effect, and it has its own little visibility button in terms of this little eye, and we can turn that on and off. It's pretty subtle. Let me go ahead and make that a little more apparent. I don't want to turn this into a layer style discussion, but I will double click on the bevel and emboss effect, and we'll take the depth and crank that up quite a bit, and we'll increase the size as well. And click OK. Now it's really obvious what's going on right there, and I can turn that effect on and off. If I was to add any other effects, such as a color overlay, and I could set this to a shade of purple. And I did that really fast, so let me go ahead and kind of show you one more time. All I did was check the box for color overlay, and that gives you a little color picker here that we can select and set to any other color, and click OK. Now you'll notice under my effects I can turn off the color overlay, I can turn off the bevel and emboss, or I can just turn off all effects altogether. Now what I'm going to do is throw all those away. So I'm going to come all the way up to the effects layer and just drag that to the trash can. Okay, moving over from here, we have the ability to add a mask to our layer. Now, this is not something I want to jump into. Masks are really worthy of their very own lecture, and I don't want to fall into that trap. But if I click on this, we've assigned a mask. In short, what a mask is a way for you to control what pixels are and are not visible for this particular layer. So just to show you kind of briefly how they work, right now this mask is all white, and white means completely 100% visible. If I get my paintbrush out and I hit the X key so that I'm painting black, notice that I currently have the mask selected, not the layer like I do now. Actually click on the mask and you can see it get highlighted. Now if I paint black within this mask, look what's going on in my document. It's like I'm erasing. But I'm not. I'm just telling Photoshop what pixels on this layer I want to be visible and which ones I don't. Black is invisible, white is visible. When I'm done, I can right-click on this layer and just delete it, and everything goes back to the way it was. And masks are extremely powerful. If you're completely new to Photoshop, they're one of those things where you might be a little confused by them. Don't worry about it right now. I just wanted to let you know that you can create masks right here in your layer panel, but for the time being, it's not important that you know exactly all the ways they work and how you can use them. All right, moving on from here, we have the ability to create adjustment layers. And adjustment layers are exactly what the name suggests. They're a layer that you can add to your layer stack that provides some sort of adjustment. We can drop on a solid color layer, which I did earlier, and this just gives you a color picker. And really, all it's done is given us a solid color that fills the entire canvas. At any time, I can double-click on the icon for it, and I can change the color to anything I like. I'm just going to go ahead and throw that away. Now, I have a separate series of lectures lined up for each one of these adjustment layers, so we're not going to talk about them right now. Just the idea that you can have them is enough for the time being. Next, if we move over, we have grouping. A group is an interesting thing, and I really want to have a separate lecture over groups, but I will show you very quickly what these are. If you click on it, you get a little thing that says Group 1, and it looks like a folder. It is like a folder. You can take as many layers as you want and you can stick them inside the group. You can also nest groups. You can have groups within groups. And by doing this, you can collapse your stack of layers down to a single thing. So for example, if I take layer 3, I can drag it up on top of this group. And now notice, instead of just the single darkened line, I get a little box that surrounds the entire group. When I let go, you'll notice that now layer 3 is indented underneath the group. So I can collapse that down, and I can switch off visibility for the group. I can take layer 2 and do the same thing. So now layers 2 and 3 are inside this group, and I can turn off their visibility with a single click. It's for a lot more than just organization, but it certainly is very useful for organization. I'm going to grab both those layers, drag them both outside the group, so I just have a thick bar appearing between the bottom of the group and layer 1. Now you'll notice they're no longer indented, and I can take that group and just throw it away. Now we've already seen the new layer button. We've made use of that. You click on it, you get a brand new layer, and we've seen the trash can, which you can just click on, or you can drag layers down to it. Now something else you can do is drag an existing layer right down to the new layer button, and what that's going to do is copy off that layer. So now you can see, if I grab the move tool with the V key, that we have 2 copies of layer 3. And it's actually named layer 3 copy. I'm going to throw that away by dragging that down to the trash can. You can also grab a layer or a selection of layers, and you can drag them down to the group, and it'll automatically put those inside of a group for you. So you got some nice little features there to help speed up your workflow. Finally, if you take a look in the Layers panel, you've got this little drop-down menu. Every single panel over here inside of Photoshop has this menu, and it's different for each panel. A lot of these commands we've already seen in some form or fashion, but the one I want to focus on here is just the ability to take a look at your layer properties, which we've already seen. We can also take a look at the panel options. This is something that I did want to point out. You can change the thumbnail size for your layer panel. So if I set this up as big as it'll go, you'll notice that my thumbnails get huge and it's a lot easier to see what's going on, which can be very useful for a very big document. But I'll leave them down fairly small for the time being. You can make the thumbnail contents include the layer bounds or the entire document. Let me kind of point out what that does. I'll leave my thumbnails huge just for a moment, and we'll switch this over to layer bounds. Take a look at my layers before I hit OK. Notice that 3 is positioned in the upper right-hand corner, 2 is down at the bottom, and 1 is in the upper left corner, just like they are in the document. If I switch this to layer bounds and click OK, then they all kind of get strangely shaped thumbnails, but we're only seeing just those pixels that are included in the layer. So if you just want to see what you've painted, then you can use that option. The cool thing, however, about using the entire document is that at a glance you can get an idea of where those pixels are located on your screen. Otherwise, it can be a little bit tricky. Then finally, we have some other options that are pretty useful. Use default masks on fill layers. You saw when I created the color fill layer, we already had a mask on it. If you didn't see that, I can show you real quick. Let me go ahead and just click OK to get out of here. If we go back over to our adjustment layers button, and I choose solid color, I don't really care what color it is. We already have a mask, which is visible right here on the right-hand side of this layer. So we go back down to panel options. That's because a default mask was automatically created. Expand new effects. What this means is that, let me go ahead and throw away this solid color layer. If I create a new effect, like say on the number 3, so let's go back over to our effects button, which we've already hit a couple of times in this video. And this time let's do something different. Let's do stroke. And just click OK. That effect comes in opened up. Now I'm going to throw that away just by clicking on the word effects and dragging that to the trash can. Now let's go back over to our panel options and I'll just switch that off. And now this time if I do the exact same thing and choose stroke, click OK, well, it's already expanded anyway. Well, that's not exactly what I thought would happen, but that's okay anyway. We'll just kind of move on. All right, now moving down through panel options. The last one we have is add copy to copied layers. And you saw earlier when I made a copy of layer 3, it was actually called layer 3 copy. If you don't want to see the word copy, then just switch that off. Okay, so that is a rundown, a very basic rundown of the interface for the layers panel. I'm going to switch this back over to the way I like to see it, which is with much, much smaller thumbnails because I think the big ones are kind of distracting. We've taken a look at kind of how layers are created, how they can be arranged. We've taken a look at the interface for the layers panel, and that is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.